Welcome, Wargamers, back to the grim and unforgiving realm of Shyish, or honestly kind of any realm really, because our subject today is found far and wide across the mortal realms. I'm talking about the Deathrattle legions that are scattered throughout the realms, and so this might seem a bit random, but I was looking for topics for the week and I was just flipping through several battle tomes looking for something to jump out at me. And I was actually looking to see if there was any new information on like Soulblight when the Deathrattle section really stood out. Now, I've often said that Legions of Nagash doesn't interest me so much as an army because all I ever see on the table are these massive blocks of skeletons that don't actually do a whole lot except crowd control and sit on the board and are a pain to clear out. And that's a game balance thing, that's not a lore thing, and if it's your jam, please have fun with it. I just don't want to own that as an army. It's not how I like to play. But in truth, if the option is available, I love Necromancy as a narrative lead, and the things in the Legions of Nagash battle tome only stoke that excitement more. Because what's here is so cool, and I just want to talk about it, daydream about what would be rad, and give death a little time in the sun. So what are the Deathrattle Kingdoms? Well, in short, it's kind of a catch-all term referring to civilizations predominantly made up of undead, specifically skeletons, where the meat and sinew of their mortal coils has rotted away. Now, when I think skeleton warriors, my mind immediately goes to a Necromancer raising a great army to fight in his name, but Age of Sigmar has so much more to offer than that single narrative perspective. Whether they set up their kingdom near, a fount of death magic, or they bear a cursed artifact, or some other great power demands it, Deathrattle Kingdoms can spawn naturally. They don't need someone pulling the strings. It's not like they need the Necromancer to conjure them and he acts as their entire mind. These can be completely isolated kingdoms that occur naturally, and across the realms and their geography, these can look quite different from one another. Some can be bartered with for goods and services, others subjugate the living population around them, while other cultures integrate the dead into their ranks. On a note that I want to pause and I want to bring up my favorite Black Library book, and that is Nagash, Undying King. I've talked about it a few times here on the channel, and in that we meet a tribe of humans that live in Shyish, and it's a wonderful look at how diverse cultures can be in Age of Sigmar. In that society, when someone dies, they have a funeral essentially, but the body is treated in such a way that the flesh dissolves off very quickly, and the society member is resurrected as a skeleton. Most importantly, they retain their memories and personalities to an extent. Obviously, having died, I'm sure their perspective on life has changed a bit. And these members are revered since they hold valuable wisdom that the clan needs to thrive. There's no evil, twisted necromancer. It's a society that reveres death as a part of life, and they pay, homage to Nagash and deeply respect the afterlife in this way. And I'm quick to point that book out because it's a great example of skeleton, in Age of Sigmar terms, units having some level of autonomy, which is not a common trope all that much. The battle tome makes it clear that White Kings, the leaders of Deathrattle Kingdoms, have full mental faculties. They don't need to bow to anyone, provided they have the will to resist Necromancer's use of death magic against them. But it's a lot less clear when it comes to the more common folk, right? The endless ranks of skeletons that make up the real fighting force. I get the sense that the level of autonomy and intelligence of each skeleton warrior is largely dependent on exactly what brought them back to life, if the intent was to give them their minds and so on. And so to that end, I kind of see it as sort of a spectrum, right? On one end you have Undying King, where, they're still functional members of society, and then the other end is the more common trope of a totally mindless corpse that moves under the will of another. Point is, you can make your faction fit anywhere along this spectrum. But because the potential for intelligence exists, it opens up a wide range of possibilities that I really hadn't thought about in other fantasy properties. And I think that flexibility really lets them fit into the overall world much more easily as these free agents, because let's build a kingdom right now from the lore that we know. We could have a White King that has his whole city cursed with undeath, right? But they aren't evil, and they aren't warlike, and in exchange for land, bones, whatever they need, they can offer a tireless workforce that needs no sleep, no water, no food. If you're a living human, that's not a bad neighbor to have at all. They can be eternal gardeners of the forests of the realms, allying with Sylvaneth, a continuous weapons factory for the forces of chaos. The possibilities of how diverse your factions can be and how they interact with others outweigh dramatically the options that we get on the tabletop. And to me, that's awesome, when there begins to be so much narrative potential that the game struggles to keep up, and you just let your imagination go crazy. Now, one thing I am very curious about, and having kind of reread Legions of Nagash now in hindsight after Ossiarch Bone Reapers come out, is how this faction would interact with a small army of Bone Reapers. I went through looking in the Ossiarch Bone Reapers battle tome. I couldn't find a single story of how these two factions really relate. And for those who don't know, the Ossiarch Bone Reapers are the latest death faction to kind of enter the fray. Each one of them is a construct, meaning they use bone as a base material. The Bone Shapers temper it until it's hard as metal and shape and craft it into the various warriors and units. And their big mission, or iconic thing, is the tithe. Right? To keep their war effort going, they constantly keep accruing bones from every culture they encounter. Not seeing it as the remains of people, but as raw material. Kind of like how we see wood, iron ore, and such. So if an Ossiarch Bone Reaper army was to roll up to a Deathrattle Kingdom, what happens? Either they destroy the Deathrattle, right, use them as raw materials, which would be like striking oil because it's just tons of resources in the exact same spot. Or they can just ignore them. But honestly, that seems a bit unlikely, right? There's not really any stories of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers respecting another faction's privacy and just moving along. And I say ignore them because, they're suffused with death magic, they just don't register them as being a threat or anything like that. And I don't have an answer to this question. But here's a story I would love, right? An Ossiarch Bone Reaper army rolls up to a Deathrattle Kingdom where the citizens are sentient. They still have their minds and their character. And this would create such an interesting perspective, right? The skeletons have personalities and memories, but they're ultimately nothing more than a natural resource for the Bone Reapers. And honestly, it's got to be weird to try and reason with someone who looks at you that way, right? Not as an easily replaceable peon like the other skeletons probably do, but as literally a resource and nothing else. On the flip side, the Bone Reapers do have more autonomy than many other death armies. They just take the best parts of souls, mash them together, and whatever mind that creates has the freedom to execute their commands with a degree of freedom. So then we have to view this issue from their perspective as well, right? How do you walk away from a goldmine of resources you need for your only mission, right? The reason you were literally handcrafted, but the goldmine is a fellow death army, and they can do things as an ally and support you. No matter what happens, I think it's safe to say that if a Bone Reaper's army walks up to a Deathrattle Kingdom, things are not going to leave unchanged, right? Something's going to happen, whether they're destroyed and their bones are used to create new Bone Reapers, or the kingdom is enslaved into a life of menial work for war efforts. They aren't just going to keep trucking. And so I just wanted to talk about that. We haven't talked about death armies in quite a while on the channel. I thought it was a fun idea. So let's talk about why would the Deathrattle Kingdoms be such a cool army? And I want them to be different than the Bone Reapers, right? Autonomy is a fascinating concept within the Death faction. It breeds so many fantastic narratives. Because the moment you add sentience to something that has the finality of death, interesting situations are born. There's perspectives that we can't comprehend, that we can interact with. The stakes that might seem so dire to us as the living might seem trivial to the undead. But it doesn't mean they don't care about things. It doesn't mean they don't have their own agendas and personalities and the way that they go about things. If I could, I'd have a black library book that explores all of these things and repaints a picture of death factions now that Nagash has unleashed the Necroquake and the undead are rampant, right? How do existing death armies, because there was some order and structure within them before all of this happened with the Necroquake. There were what we now know as Nighthaunt, there were a few spirits and Geist all kind of roaming around. There obviously were Deathrattle Kingdoms, Soulblight Empires, all these things. We never really got a good glimpse of what death factions think of what Nagash did. It kind of just seemed like Nagash was the center character doing everything, but the truth is all these independent, largely, kingdoms would have their own reactions, their own turmoil within them, and I would love to see that. Anyway, friends, let me know what you think. I would love to see something drawn up more with the Deathrattle Legions, as well as just kind of giving Legions of Nagash new ways to play and new units for them so they can have kind of a more diverse roster. I would love to see that kind of stuff on the table. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you in my next Age of Sigmar lore video. Happy wargaming. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. It was made possible by the folks over here to the left. These are my top supporters over here on YouTube and on Patreon that keep this channel going. If you'd like to learn more about how to become a supporter and get some cool things in the process, like exclusive pictures and interactions with me and get your questions answered here on the channel, go ahead and click any of the links down below or the join button on the community page over on YouTube. Regardless of your choice, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me with this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one. Happy wargaming.